As the U.S. Air Force continues to reshape its vision for the future of air superiority, one element of its new strategy has set itself apart as perhaps the most promising and potentially significant air warfare technology of the modern day. AI-enabled drones, meant to fly and fight on behalf of human pilots, known to many as the Loyal Wingman concept, but known within the Air Force as Collaborative Combat Aircraft, or CCAs. But despite all of the discussion surrounding this concept in official and non-official circles, there's one element that has thus far gone largely ignored: America's pressing need for new air-to-air weapons that are purpose-built for these platforms. So let's talk about America's collaborative combat aircraft, how the Air Force envisions using them, and why weapons like today's AIM-120 AMRAAM, tomorrow's AIM-260 Joint Advanced Tactical Missile, and even the Navy's massive new AIM-174 just aren't going to cut it for the future drone force. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. Collaborative combat aircraft, or CCAs, have been the focus of increasing attention throughout the Air Force and aerospace media alike in recent years, as perceptions of the concept have shifted from artificial intelligence-enabled support for a new batch of exquisite high-end fighters to what now appears to be the very foundation of America's near-future approach to air warfare. These semi-autonomous UCAVs, or unmanned combat aerial vehicles, seem to be so promising that even as the Air Force steps back to re-evaluate the next-generation air dominance fighter that's already been in development for a decade, the branch remains fully invested in the CCA concept that's germinated out of the same program. CCAs, as the Air Force describes them, are powered by air-breathing jet engines, though some do use rockets to take off without a runway. They're able to fly alone or in groups and can be equipped for a wide variety of mission sets, ranging from air-to-air combat, air-to-ground strike operations, electronic warfare, intelligence gathering, and more. To put it simply, CCA drones will allow every crewed fighter of the future to be transformed into an entire formation unto itself, with a constellation of CCAs flying out ahead and around 4th, 5th, and 6th generation fighters to establish self-healing mesh networks of sensors and shooters that the Pentagon refers to as kill webs. CCA drones will extend the sensor reach of crewed fighters, provide improved situational awareness in every direction, increase the amount of ordnance or support assets carried into the fight, and if called for, may even sacrifice themselves to save the crewed aircraft. These advanced drones will be piloted by rapidly maturing artificial intelligence agents, as they're known, currently being developed through efforts like the Air Force's Skyborg program that's already seen a heavily modified F-16, known as the X-62 Vista, take on human fighter pilots in real air combat exercises entirely under AI control. New efforts like Project Venom, short for Viper Experimentation and Next Gen Operations Mode, are equipping a batch of combat-coded F-16s with these same AI pilots for further testing as we speak. Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall has gone on record to say the Air Force intends to purchase at least 1,000 of these CCA drones in the coming years, originally meant to provide 2 CCAs for each of 200 new NGAD fighters and 300 new Block 4 F-35s. But now, with the NGAD fighters' future in question, the Air Force has not signaled any intention of reducing its CCA order, and instead could potentially equip F-22 Raptors or even F-15EXs with the requisite systems needed to manage this drone fleet. Kendall has also provided a target price for these new drones at between $25 and $30 million per unit, a bit more than 1/3 of the cost of a new F-35, and therein lies the basis for some painful arithmetic. At this price point, 1,000 new CCA aircraft will cost the Air Force between $25 and $30 billion in acquisitions alone, not including the more than $1 billion already allocated to research and development. For a branch that's facing substantial budgetary shortfalls created by massive overruns in programs like the LGM-35 Sentinel ICBM effort, even the roughly $9 billion allocated to CCA development through 2029 may not be set in stone. Especially because making the CCA concept work means not only being able to procure 1,000 of these advanced drones in the coming years, but maintaining active production lines to replace airframes as they're lost, or to produce upgraded iterations as technology permits. In other words, 1,000 CCA airframes shouldn't be seen as the end of CCA production, but rather the beginning. Especially if these platforms prove to be as game-changing as the Air Force seems to believe. And what this all means is that now more than ever, capability has to be balanced against affordability. Now, this is already the focus of several efforts, ranging from fielding lower-cost sensors to new additive manufacturing techniques. But there's one under-discussed element that's likely to play a huge role in dictating the per-unit costs of these aircraft that is yet to be addressed in the public sphere in really any appreciable way, and that's America's dated air-to-air missile designs. Now, it's really important to understand that when I say dated, I don't mean ineffective. And to help you better appreciate what I mean, let's talk about the AMRAAM. The AIM-120 Advanced Medium Range Air-to-Air Missile, or AMRAAM, is America's primary beyond visual range, or long-distance air-to-air weapon. It entered service late in 1991 as a replacement for America's AIM-7 Sparrow. Now, despite boasting its own onboard radar seeker, something the Sparrow lacked, the AMRAAM was thinner and lighter than its predecessor, but nonetheless was designed with very similar exterior dimensions, and that was on purpose, meant to streamline integration into a long list of tactical aircraft. The new AMRAAM was 150 pounds lighter than the Sparrow, thanks to a 1-inch smaller diameter, but nonetheless stretched the same 12 feet from front to back. Matching the form factor of the Sparrow was useful, as the older weapon had been integrated into nearly a dozen American-made and foreign-made tactical aircraft at that point, making the transition to the newer, more capable weapon as simple as possible. And just about 1 year after entering service, in December of 1992, an American F-16 would score the weapon's first air-to-air kill against an Iraqi MiG-25, with another, this time against a MiG-23, following less than a month later. In the years since, the AMRAAM has evolved through several iterations, with today's most advanced AIM-120s in testing now said to be reaching the range threshold of the weapon's own intended replacement, the forthcoming AIM-260 Joint Advanced Tactical Missile, at what is certain to be ranges of greater than 100 miles, and potentially as much as 3 times the AMRAAM's original 40-mile range. But what's craziest about the AMRAAM's rapid improvements is the fact that they've been made with next to no changes to the missile's exterior dimensions. Rapid advancements in rocket propulsion technology and onboard computing power, enabling the weapon to calculate the most efficient flight path to its target, have replaced the decades-old technology found inside, while the outside remained largely unchanged. Now, as you likely know, since entering service back in '91, the AIM-120 has become America's primary beyond visual range air-to-air missile, bolstered in close-quarters combat by the short-range AIM-9 Sidewinder class of weapons. And because of that, America's stealth fighters, the F-22 and F-35, both of which made their way to service well after the AMRAAM's reign began, were designed specifically to house these 12-foot monsters internally, keeping the weapons tucked inside their weapons bays to maintain their stealth profile. And what this means is the most advanced stealth fighters in the world were effectively designed around a missile form factor dictated by the original Sparrow missile that entered service 66 years ago. And that trend is continuing today, with the new AIM-260 being designed to offer the same basic exterior dimensions as today's AIM-120, again, for the sake of easy integration into aircraft that were designed to carry the AMRAAM. The AIM-260 being developed by Lockheed Martin is expected to represent a similar leap over today's AMRAAMs as that original AIM-120 was over the Sparrow, including what may be twice the range of some earlier AMRAAM iterations. This, of course, has been made possible, again, by rapid advancements in rocket and microchip technologies, once again making it possible to cram even more capability into the same dimensions. But that alone highlights the fact that today's AMRAAMs just straight up don't need to be as big as they are. In fact, both Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, now RTX, have unveiled weapons in recent years that promised to offer the same or better range and capabilities of today's AIM-120s in roughly half the size. And while these weapons were once touted as a means to double the internal capacity of stealth fighters like the F-22, they could be even more valuable as the weapons of choice for the Air Force's new CCA drones instead. Now, what prompted this whole line of thought for me was a report released earlier this year by the Mitchell Institute of Aerospace Studies about a series of war games they conducted meant to simulate American intervention into a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Now, the point of these games was to assess the best use cases for a variety of CCA and lower-cost drone designs to penetrate and degrade China's sprawling web of anti-air and anti-ship weapons meant to keep American forces at bay. We tend to call this collective capability China's anti-access area denial strategy. Despite identifying 10 different types of potential drone aircraft for these roles, each playthrough of these wargames identified the pressing need for 2 types of air-to-air drones for large-scale combat operations. In the first days of the offensive, their report calls for using a large number of lower-cost counter-air drones, each capable of carrying the equivalent of 2 AMRAAMs on board. These drones should be seen as somewhat attritable, as the Air Force calls it, or in other words, should be cheap enough to sacrifice without much concern. To some extent, these are the types of platforms that we've really seen in development for the CCA program today, with the first increment contracts awarded earlier this year for drones that would likely meet this need and could potentially come in at a price point of under $10 million apiece, which is certainly expensive, but not for a low observable UCAV that's capable of air-to-air combat. But after the first few days of combat operations, these war games pointed to the need for a much larger, stealthier, and more capable CCA design, which they dubbed CCA-3s. These platforms would need to offer substantial range and loiter time for combat air patrols, advanced stealth to survive in contested airspace for extended periods of time, advanced sensors like you'd find in today's high-end fighters, and importantly, much larger payloads of at least 6 AMRAAM-type weapons to enable their air superiority mission. And that brings us back around to the problem with today's AMRAAMs. Because the truth is, big missiles mean big drones, and big drones mean big budgets. As the Rand Corporation laid out for the first time as far back as 1966, a great deal of what dictates the production cost of new aircraft comes down to quantity, aircraft performance, i.e. speed and range requirements, and weight. Quantity, of course, is just a measure of production at scale, with costs coming down as production volume goes up. The speed for America's CCAs are more or less set, with the US clearly aiming for low observable subsonic aircraft, and that really leaves weight as one of the biggest factors informing the overall cost of these platforms. Now, this is, of course, a big oversimplification. Today, maybe more so than in 1966, the avionics, systems, and sensors carried on board these aircraft can be one of the biggest cost drivers, with the determining factors being just how advanced the systems will be. But assuming the need for these systems are fixed, regardless of which platform is ultimately fielded, we can still look to weight as one of the few variables we have any real control over. Now, weight in this context encompasses a great deal and informs a great deal more, ranging from the onboard systems and avionics you can carry, to the propulsion systems you need to meet performance requirements, the materials you make the aircraft out of, how much fuel storage you need, and of course, your payload capacity. Now, in terms of how that payload affects weight, we actually have to think of it in two different ways. The first is direct weight, or how much the weapons themselves weigh. But the second is indirect weight, or how the space occupied by these weapons informs the internal volume of the payload bay, and in turn, the overall size and weight of the rest of the aircraft. Larger weapons need larger payload bays, which often means a larger aircraft overall, which means more material involved in construction and a higher overall weight, which may mean needing a larger engine or engines to meet performance requirements. Larger engines consume more fuel, which dictates the need for more fuel storage in order to meet range requirements, which also adds weight, and the cycle continues until you suddenly find that your small, low-cost drone has ballooned into an unmanned B-52. And with the production numbers and performance requirements for these platforms largely set already, and the assumption that the avionics found on board will be the same regardless of platform design, that leaves payload as one of the few remaining levers that designers can pull to bring down the overall cost of each CCA in production, which is why designing these aircraft around the 6-decade-old form factor of today's AMRAAMs just isn't the best option. But as I've mentioned before, there are other options to consider, and there's at least some evidence to suggest that the Air Force is already considering them. Now, discussions surrounding what the Air Force would eventually call its Small Advanced Capability Missile, or SACM, can be traced back to at least 2011, when Dr. John Beach Wilcox included a brief mention of these miniaturized air-to-air missiles in a presentation he gave at the 37th Air Armament Symposium. In that and several other Defense Department documents I got my hands on, these missiles are described as flexible, hyper-agile weapons that use high impulse or extremely efficient rocket propulsion, anti-jam guidance with a wide field of view, and an increased PWE, or probability of weapon effectiveness, against 4th and 5th generation threats. In 2011, Dr. Wilcox's report suggested these weapons were slated to begin early conceptual demonstrations in late 2017 and spanning through early 2020. But a subsequent 2016 report from the U.S. Army Research Lab about new weapons technologies showed integrated weapon demonstrations from the Air Force's SACM program beginning as early as the start of 2015, with ongoing tests scheduled through the end of 2021. That same year, now former Air Force Research Lab Director Dr. David E. Walker provided a written report to the House Armed Services Committee that included a single brief mention of these new mini-missiles and the branch's tentative plans to begin acquiring them in the 2030 timeframe. The public was first introduced to this concept in 2012 in a rather unusual way, with images surfacing from the year's Air Force Association Technology Expo of a scale model F-35 with its weapon bay doors open to reveal a whopping 12 seemingly teeny-tiny air-to-air missiles stowed inside. Now, currently, the F-35 is capable of carrying just 4 AIM-120 AMRAAMs internally, though Lockheed Martin's Sidekick adapter, intended to come as part of the Block 4 upgrade, will increase that figure to 6. These miniature missiles, we'd come to learn, were called CUDAs. And what little has been revealed about them would be truly groundbreaking even today, more than a decade later. Press materials released by Lockheed Martin at the time said the weapon was just 70 inches long, less than half the length of an AMRAAM, but with similar or even greater range and a mind-boggling degree of maneuverability. Lockheed did not officially discuss the weapon's weight, but some media reports claimed it was as low as 103 pounds. Now, because the weapon is only about the size of a GBU-39 small-diameter bomb, Lockheed Martin claimed that it could fit on existing small-diameter bomb racks in the F-35, though the F-35 is currently only rated to carry 8 GBU-39s, so how they stuffed 12 in there is anybody's guess. But rather than using a proximity-fused blast fragmentation warhead like most air-to-air missiles, the CUDA was designed using hit-to-kill technology made possible thanks to what Lockheed described as extremely high-G maneuverability. I'm going to quote an unnamed Lockheed Martin media rep who spoke to Flight Global at the time. CUDA is a highly lethal interceptor that defeats targets by direct body-to-body impact. At impact, CUDA sweeps its mass directly through the target at a selected point of vulnerability. The CUDA was said to use propulsive bursts from around the rocket body to allow for those extreme aerobatic maneuvers, which, in conjunction with images of the weapon or a mock-up of it, suggest that it would maneuver in a similar way to Lockheed Martin's Patriot PAC-3 interceptor, and that point was seemingly confirmed by statements made by Lockheed Martin about the technology already being in service with the US Army. Discussions of CUDA have largely fallen silent since, though in 2019, Lockheed Martin reportedly displayed a different F-35 model shown carrying just 4 CUDA missiles on different types of racks inside, at a missile defense conference in Alabama, though Lockheed later claimed to have displayed this model by mistake. Perhaps unrelated, but less than a month after Lockheed's CUDA mistake, Raytheon stepped to the forefront of the SACM conversation by revealing their own mini-missile, dubbed the Peregrine. Like Lockheed's CUDA, Raytheon's Peregrine is touted as offering the same or greater range of the AIM-120 in a weapon that's half the size and offers the aerobatic maneuverability of the AIM-9X. The Peregrine missile is slightly longer than the CUDA at roughly 6 feet long, but is still less than half the length of the AMRAAM. Raytheon also disclosed a weight of roughly 150 pounds, more than 200 pounds lighter than the AMRAAM. This weapon, we've come to learn, was among 2 missile concepts Raytheon received a $14 million contract from the Air Force Research Lab to continue maturing back in 2016. Now, Mark Noyes, Vice President of Business Development and Strategy for Raytheon Missile Systems at the time, disclosed that the Peregrine missile carries a multi-mode autonomous seeker, which some news outlets have reported as a tri-mode seeker. Now, this likely points toward an onboard radar seeker like those found in the AMRAAM, an electro-optical infrared seeker like those found in the AIM-9X, and likely a home-in on jam capability for circumstances when the 2 more conventional seekers find themselves flummoxed by electronic warfare attacks. I'm going to quote Noyes here. It will be beyond medium range. I can't go into specifics, as you can appreciate, but it can do everything from short range to beyond visual range to beyond medium range. Now, what exactly beyond medium range might mean could be subject to some interpretation. Traditionally speaking, any weapon with a range of greater than, say, 31 miles or so could technically be considered greater than medium range. But in 2019, Raytheon officials were quoted as saying that this weapon could meet or exceed the range performance of modern AMRAAMs, and by then, the AIM-120C7 had already been in service for nearly a decade, with a range that could potentially be anywhere between 75 and 111 miles, depending on the source that you trust. And importantly, this was 4 years after the AIM-120D, that likely has a range in excess of 100 miles and maybe as far as 120 was already in service. Now, unlike the hit-to-kill Cuda, Raytheon's Peregrine carries a traditional blast fragmentation warhead, which likely accounts for its slightly larger dimensions and weight. The Peregrine also accomplished its high degree of maneuverability in a different way, using thrust-vectoring rocket motors more akin to the one found on the highly aerobatic AIM-9X Sidewinder. Both of these weapons have been highly touted as a means to increase the combat capacity of existing stealth and even non-stealth aircraft thanks to their smaller dimensions and significantly lower weight. But as the Air Force continues to mature its CCA concepts, these weapons could prove vital to keeping the weight and in turn the cost of these new drones down. Now, if the US Air Force were to follow the recommendations of the Mitchell Institute and work toward fielding CCA drones capable of carrying at least 6 AMRAAMs on board, this would require a sizable payload bay. When staggered next to one another as these weapons are stowed inside stealth fighters like the F-35 and F-22, some quick back-of-the-envelope math suggests this new CCA drone would need an internal payload bay that measures roughly 13.4 inches tall, 67.8 inches wide, and 156 inches long. Now that's a payload bay that's roughly 5.5 feet, or around 1.7 meters wide, and 13 feet, or around 3.96 meters long. And with each AMRAAM weighing in at around 356 pounds, that means this larger CCA would need to be able to carry around 2,136 pounds of ordnance into the fight. Now, conversely, a drone designed to carry the equivalent loadout of Peregrine missiles would need a payload bay that's roughly the same width, at 5.5 feet or around 1.7 meters, but that could be less than 7 feet long, less than half the length. But maybe most important of all, 6 Peregrine missiles would only weigh in at around 900 pounds, representing more than 1,200 pounds in weight savings. A drone designed around the even smaller Cuda missile could have an even shorter payload bay, by a few inches anyway, and might be able to get away with carrying as little as just 618 pounds worth of weapons for a whopping 1,518 pounds worth of weight savings. At these sizes and weights, it may even be possible to arm CCAs already in testing, designed around the ability to accommodate just 2 AMRAAMs with 6 or more of these SACM-style missiles without much in the way of changes. Northrop Grumman's Model 437 Vanguard, for instance, is said to have payload bays designed around accommodating a pair of AMRAAMs. But the aircraft is rated for payloads of up to 2,000 pounds, meaning not only could you easily cram 4 SACM-style missiles into that payload bay, but it can support the weight of all 6 if you can find a way to stuff them in there. Of course, we have yet to get a look at the Vanguard's payload bay, so consider that hypothetical. In recent years, the world's media has placed a massive emphasis on nations fielding new defense technologies, exquisite high-end platforms and systems like nuclear hypersonic missiles, new stealth fighters, AI-enabled war machines, and more. But as we've seen play out over nearly 3 years of Russian fumbles in Ukraine, there is a vast gap between building a handful of technology demonstrators meant to garner media attention and fielding actual combat systems in sufficient numbers to matter in a real fight. And now, as the Air Force looks for ways to secure air dominance under a decidedly lower budgetary top line than they previously intended, cutting corners on expensive programs like NGAD alone likely won't be enough to guarantee the budget is there for the production capacity that America needs. It will almost certainly also come down to finding ways to make the 1,000 or more CCAs being built as cost-effective as possible, especially as this program runs into delays and cost overruns, as really every new aircraft program eventually does. And when range, performance, and avionics are dictated by the mission set these platforms aim to fill, payload becomes the most logical place to look for cost savings. And if the United States can field missiles that can shoot down enemy fighters from 100 miles away at less than half the size of today's weapons, the only reason not to might be the cost of standing up new production lines for these groundbreaking new missiles. And while that's certainly an important consideration, at some point we have to ask ourselves, when exactly are we going to stop designing the aircraft of our future around missiles from 60 years in our past? And based on the evidence, it seems at least possible, if not feasible, that time is coming sooner than you might think. And with that ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.